Hello, everybody, and welcome to the HuntScience podcast. I'm your host, Eric Lance, a professionally certified wildlife biologist and natural resource professional, college professor, and owner of Land Source Consulting. The HuntScience podcast is dedicated to bring you the latest information on popular habitat management topics, wildlife science, hunting strategies, and the general conservation and land management practices to help preserve our natural resources. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to have you with us and hope that you enjoy today's episode. With that said, let's get started. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by our primary sponsor, Land Source Consulting. Land Source Consulting is an Ohio-based wildlife and land management consulting company that I own and operate not only here in Ohio, but through the Midwest and beyond. At Land Source, we work with private landowners just like you to build and develop those property-specific management programs to help bring the goals that you have on your property to life. If you're interested in getting more information on who we are and how we can help you, please visit us over at landsourceconsulting.com. There you can check out the different service packages and capabilities that we can provide. We would love to hear from you, so don't hesitate to reach out to us and schedule that free consultation either through our website, or you can reach out to us and connect with us on our other social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram. That's landsourceconsulting.com, building relationships for a more sustainable future. All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the HuntScience podcast. As always, I'm your host, Eric Lance, and today I am joined by Dr. Steve Demarais from the famous MSU Deer Lab. Dr. Steve, how you doing?
Great. And if you enter MSU online, it'll get Michigan State University. So I want to make sure people understand that we're MSU South. We're Mississippi State University. And they grabbed the msu.edu name early on, and so we go by msstate.edu.
There you go. I'm an Ohio boy, so I'll have to edit out that M word that you just said, but that's okay. I didn't go to Ohio State. I went to Virginia Tech, so it's a little different, but still, it hurts the heart as an Ohio boy.
Well, and MSU North, I mean, they're like our brother, cousin department. They are like us. They do stuff that matters to apply in applied management. So there's no knock. I'm happy for people to confuse us with Michigan State. They're nice people.
It's the other M word.
Yeah,
it's that other M word. I can deal with MSU. It's all right. I got friends that are alumni from there, so it's like I can tolerate that, but the other M word I just can't do.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you for coming on. I know you're busy. I know, especially in this industry, you're probably getting pulled from every different direction. So, giving me a little bit of time for my show, I really appreciate it. So like I do with all my guests, they're, just starting off, my listener base, there might be people that know you, people that might not know you. So go take a minute, who are you? Where'd you grow up? What led you down to becoming the researcher at MSU?
Yeah, well, I'm from Massachusetts, New England. Born and raised, and went to school at the University of Massachusetts. And I grew up hunting and fishing, and my favorite subject in school was biology. And I remember the day I went to the guidance counselor's office, and because my parents said, hey, you're going to college, figure out what you want to major in. So I went, and there's this big, thick book of jobs. And I'm flipping through it, and I find this page on wildlife biologist, and it's talking about the classes you have to take and job opportunity. I think, wow, this is what I want to do. Because up to that point, I didn't really know. I knew what I loved to do, and I knew what I was good in. But that day, I literally still remember vividly. I was a junior in high school, and I walked into that guidance counselor's office, and it's been a trajectory ever since. I went to the University of Massachusetts, and they said, hey, you got to get a graduate degree in this field to have job flexibility and job opportunities. So I looked at grad school, and I actually came to Mississippi State University for my master's, and then they asked me to stay on for my PhD, and I finished a PhD in 1982. And left and went to Texas for 15 years, worked at Texas A&M Kingsville and Texas Tech University. And then my former major professor retired here, and I got his job, came back, and been loving it here ever since. So I've been working with big game, ever since my first faculty position at Texas A&M Kingsville. I kind of get into it. I was actually more interested in wildlife diseases, and deer happened to be the organism that we were working with on different projects. But luckily, I just started working on everything deer, and so now I'm not a specialist in anything, Eric. I'm not a population ecologist. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a movement ecologist. I'm just a deer guy, and I've learned enough about various topics, and I think I'm pretty good at putting together research teams. So if there's a question that an agency or NGO needs to have answered, I can put together a team to answer that question. And oftentimes it's deer related, but it might be habitat. How does a timber management technique impact habitat quality for deer? And I can put together a team to do that. What's the impact of historical deer restoration on current genetic composition of deer in a state? I can put together a team to do that. So that's kind of what I've been doing, and I've loved it. I've had the job that I've been told so many times, man, I'm an accountant. I sure would love to have your job. Or, man, I'm a dentist. I sure would love to have your job. Wish I'd done that. And so I get paid to do stuff that other people pay to do. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, for sure. I hear that a lot too, and I tell people, at least on my end as a consultant, I'm like, yeah, it's in your head, it's more glamorous than what you think. I said, I was telling you off air. I mean, dealing with federal agencies, whether it's U.S. Fish and Wildlife, EPA, Army Corps of Engineers, I mean, all the different things that my company does, I'm just like, my God, I drown in paperwork.
Oh, yeah.
Like, the field work is such a small statistical percentage of the like, but it's putting all that data and everything, all the fun stuff on paper that's not fun, that you're doing 75% of the time. It's just like, it's not what you think. But, going back to the MSU Deer Lab, I think it's pretty safe to say that I know there are a lot of really good deer labs across the country, but I think the MSU one is probably, if people were to talk about a deer lab, I think you guys are probably the most popular one that gets brought up. How long has that deer lab, been around? Was it something that's always been there? Did it start, pretty low key and has really grown in its inception, since the popularity of whitetail, and especially as technology advances and more people are interested? I mean, how was the evolution, if you will, of that deer lab grown since you've been there?
Well, it actually started with my major professor for grad school. He and another professor, so Harry Jacobson was here. And he came in 1976, and another young faculty member, Dave Gwynn, were the two guys that were interested in deer research. And they started deer research in 1977, and that's actually when I came for my graduate degree. So I was here at the very beginning. It wasn't called the MSU Deer Lab then. It was just, we're doing deer research. And I came back in 1997, and it still wasn't called the MSU Deer Lab. Bronson Strickland joined us initially as a research associate and then as a faculty member. He's in wildlife extension, so he's kind of leads extension outreach, educational outreach for adults. And he's a deer nut like me. And he said, Steve, we need to brand ourselves. We do a lot of deer research. Let's brand ourselves the MSU Deer Lab. We came up with that. We worked on a logo, and a lot of our work deals with antlers. And so we're scientists. We got this magnifying glass. We look at stuff, and we're looking at antlers, and that's what our logo is. So that turned into the brand. And then he said, we really need a website. So we created msudeerlab.com, educational website. And then a few years later, he said, we really need to get involved in social media, Facebook, Twitter. And I said, okay. So we started doing that. And then a few years later after that, maybe 3 years ago, he said, we really need to do a podcast. And I said, podcast? Who listens to podcasts? And he's been critical to our broad outreach. He's led that. I'm not the leader on that. I'm just following in his coattails, but we've been greatly successful.
Oh, for sure. So one of the things I think is interesting for people to understand, and especially on a polarizing topic like white-tailed deer research, because ultimately the end user are guys that are hunters and have very strong opinions about things and some old myths and stuff. And we were talking about this. I can't remember if I was talking to someone on another podcast or just with some friends, but it's always interesting talking to researchers that have spent their career, researching a particular species. So in this case, obviously deer, but as biologists, we don't always get things right, and we're really only as good as the tools that we have to measure what it is that we're looking at. How obviously it's been massively influential in the advancement of technology, but how much have things, even in the past like 5 years, when you're looking at things and how we're advancing in telemetry data and stuff like that, how crazy is it, looking back from day one and the things that we've thought, that we knew about a particular species, in this case deer, to looking back where we are now, and what are you guys, really excited to be working on here in the next couple of years, given, advances, hopefully?
Well, one of the biggest questions we get from people, and the big questions that we've been working on, is the movement of deer, and to properly document that movement, you have to know where they are, and you can't just know where they are when you see them, because they're secretive animals. So, radio telemetry is the key to that. Now, radio telemetry has been around. It was available in the 70s and 80s. A lot of people were doing it, but back then, into the 90s, the projects that I've been involved with on relocating animals using collars deals with triangulation. So they're just sending out a signal, and you have to use a directional antenna and point it at them and figure out, okay, from this spot, they are 45 degrees from north. And then you drive around, or you have a second person at another location that does the same thing from their point and does a triangulation. And from that point, it's 128 degrees from north, and you cross those lines, and that's the estimation of where that animal is located. That ends up with a very rough estimate, because there's error associated with estimating the direction and then the person that's doing it. So there's a lot of the error arcs and error.
Yeah.
There's a lot of error in that. So that's how we did it in the 70s, 80s, 90s. GPS collars started coming in really in the 2000s. It's basically, thank goodness we have these cell phones that are so able to, pinpoint locations, because that's what we basically have attached to deer collars now, is a cell phone that tells us, sends it to a satellite and says, this deer is here. And now we're within, 5 to 10 meters accuracy. And so it's much more accurate, and we can collect. One study we had in central Mississippi, we collected a location every 15 minutes for the adult bucks we monitored. We had 55 bucks collared, and every 15 minutes we knew where they were in theory.
Yeah, it's crazy, because I do a lot of GIS stuff, with my business, and not so much, not telemetry data, but, going out there, and I just bring it up because I think a lot of people, I know who I was talking to, and I'm not going to mention it, but yeah, we were talking. I was like, yeah, we were talking about state agencies and stuff. I'm like, yeah, but you know what? Like, you're only as good as the data that you get, whether it's hunter observation or technological data. I remember, years and years and years ago, listening to Dr. Carl Miller, talk about, scent communication, and like, 20 years ago, we thought there was an X amount of, chemicals that were, volatile chemicals that were in, the interdigital gland, for instance, and as technology advances, like, you start finding more things, and the telemetry data with the buck movement and the deer movement, which we're going to talk, for this episode, that stuff's just fascinating to me, because I look at what I'm doing GIS wise with my company and just like wetland projects and things like that, with the advances of GIS, like ArcGIS Online and all the tools that they have, and the GPS collars advance and being able to track deer in real time and map it out. I mean, it's got to be crazy. the amount of data that you get off that. But anyway, so, with that being said, so you guys have spent a lot of time obviously looking at the telemetry data, and I want to get into that. So I figure we'd start off, though, like I try to do with everything, start bare ground. As I've got, maybe some listeners that, are checking out the podcast, they want to get into hunting, don't really know a whole lot about deer, not really have immersed themselves in the past couple of years. So briefly, let's kind of start the ground by talking, about deer movement in general. What do we typically see, how deer move, and then we can start moving into more, buck related stuff.
Okay. One of the baseline pieces of understanding you need is that deer are prey species, and the job of a prey is to eat and survive and be able to reproduce. And that's the basics. And so that's what drives them. And everything they do focuses back on those basic needs. I've got to get some good food and survive long enough to breed and produce offspring. And so what they do, where they move, and when they move is all about fulfilling those three things. So if we understand that, then we can better understand how to hunt them more effectively, because they're going to be eating, and when they eat, and how breeding season affects when they eat and their movements. It's all interrelated to how we apply movement ecology information to a more successful hunt.
Yeah, that's always fun, because I think of Dr. Miller, or not Dr. Miller, Dr. Harper. I listened to him talk one time, talking about habitat management. He's like, you enjoy hunting deer, right? He's like, well, you should also enjoy killing things deer don't eat, certain plants and stuff like that. It's the same thing here. It's like, let's be very real. Why you want to do this is because you want to see more deer and you want, better success. And you're learning ecology, and you're being land stewards in the meantime, which is benefiting, a wide species of resident, animals out there in the population. So it's all good, but let's not lie to yourselves. You're learning this information. You're spending time and understanding this information for one goal: better hunting success and things like that, which isn't a bad thing. You shouldn't be shy about that. As you're trying to do this, ethically and, ecologically sound, and learn, more about something you're passionate about. So, I tell people, I'm like, it's okay to admit it. Like, you want to, but I just always go back to him with that conversation, because he always laughs when he says it. But so that's good. Now, moving into, again, I've listened to a lot of your podcasts, a lot of things that you guys have done interviews on, and I want to kind of segue into, buck movement. So, but before we do that, let's talk briefly about, have you describe, the ecology of bucks, to the movement with bachelor groups, why they're important, and kind of when you see those, and then the dispersal of those bachelor groups and those individuals, and how that kind of plays into, setting up their new territories.
Okay. So back to the three things: eating and breeding. Outside of the breeding season, bucks, once they've dropped their antlers, their job now is to eat and grow new antlers so that they can be more effective at breeding the next breeding season. And so during the post antler drop period, their testosterone levels are low. That's why the antlers fall off, the drop in testosterone. So they are now easygoing, friendly guys. And, we like company. We're not loners. Humans like groups, and deer are kind of the same. They get in these little bachelor groups and hang out from basically late spring into the summer, and they're just hanging out and doing stuff together. And oftentimes those groups are clustered around age groups. You don't see a 1-year-old hanging with a 5-year-old. Just like when I was growing up, my brother, who was 4 years older than me, did not want me hanging around with him and his friends. So you have these age grouped clusters, and they just hang out, and until the end of the summer, when their testosterone level starts increasing, and that stops the growth process of the antlers, they then become much more aggressive. The testosterone levels peak, and they shed their velvet, and they start fighting, spreading apart, because they're thinking now their driving motivation for movement is not just food, but getting ready for breeding opportunities. So they don't want to go around and have 5 guys hitting on the same doe.
Yeah.
Now you may, when there's an estrus doe, I've seen up to 8 bucks around an individual doe that was in estrus, but there's only one right with her. The others are kind of in these zones around them based on dominance hierarchy.
Yeah, you remember you learned in school, and I finally seen it really for the first time this year. This is the first time in a while this season that's wrapping up for us here in Ohio that I really hunted hard. I've just been so busy in the past between work and my girls. My daughters play, travel sports, and it just consumes my time.
Mm-hmm.
But I hunted a lot this year, and it was funny. I shot a big buck. I shot, the mature one on our area, and it was just funny. Like the next, the landowners and stuff there. My parents' property is where I hunt, and like all the neighbors and stuff my dad was talking to, it's like all the little bucks that start moving back in. They're like, it's just funny to see that, because it's like you got the big boy. It's like all the other ones are on the periphery, just kind of like trying to make their way in, and then you see that happen in real time. It's fun to see it, especially if you're on the successful harvest side of that mature buck. But watching the inner dynamics of how social they really are,
mm-hmm.
is just pretty cool to see, especially when you're not involved in the research anymore. Watching it happen from a deer stand or from a trail camera is probably something you just don't get to see it too often. So it's always interesting.
And that fighting and aggressiveness during the breeding season is not something that's unique to that season. There's a social dominance even during the friendly hangout time. The bucks in that bachelor group, they know who's boss, and they have a clear dominance level within that group, and that serves them well during that time period. But then when the testosterone levels increase, that social dominance and the need to get away from each other to do their own searching overrides any friendliness that was left around.
Yeah, it's a good segue going into now something I've heard you talk about, as far as the different personalities of bucks and as far as their movement patterns, the more mobile bucks, the more sedentary bucks,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of the tweeners, and I always find this interesting because the last couple bucks I've shot, and really since I can remember, hunting my parents' property, all the bucks I've ever shot, I've never had photos of them. They're always, transient bucks coming in from other territories. Like throughout the year, I've never seen them. My bucks on camera are young, immature, a year and a half, just, bucks that I'm just watching. But then every season, here come those. So let's talk. Let me move into talking about the different personalities that we see, with buck movement.
Okay, let me talk back in the 80s, 1980s. My first telemetry radio collar deer study was in South Texas with a dear friend, Bob Zaglin, who, if you read magazines and see photographs of deer, Bob Zaglin is a biologist like you, like me, and he's been very effective at writing articles. Deer and Deer Hunting, he's a editor for them, and but he was managing a 107,000 acre ranch at the time and wanted to do buck movement studies, and so we did. And thinking back then, we didn't have a huge sample size, and it was hard to get accurate estimates, but I remember being frustrated because we'd have like 10 adult bucks sampled, and that was a big sample size back then. Nobody was doing adult buck whitetail deer research, and I was frustrated because there was all this variation, this huge amount of variation in how bucks moved, and I didn't have enough samples then to really tease out what was going on, other than to note that there's the average home range was like 3,000 acres on an annual basis. But there were some bucks that were much smaller and some bucks that were much larger. And it wasn't until more time elapsed, more movements. We did mule deer movement studies in West Texas, but kind of the big project that led me to finally develop with my graduate students this concept of buck personality was Central Mississippi, 2015 through 2018. We call it the 55 bucks. And we determined that there's basically two types of personalities in bucks. One is about 2/3 of the bucks are what we call the sedentary personality. They live in a single home range. Now that's still a pretty large home range. I think our average home range for the sedentary bucks on an annual basis is 900 acres. And those sedentary bucks still make exploratory sallies or excursions. An excursion is just where they leave their normal home range for a day or up 3 or 4 days, travel on average a couple of miles, and go somewhere and come back. And they may never go that place again, or they may have repeated excursions to the same place, and then they may go somewhere else on another excursion, but they live in one home range. And then there's this second personality that's about 1/3 of the buck population, and they live in 2 or more places. And kind of our previous poster child for this was a buck from the Central Mississippi study that lived, and we caught him in August, Eric. It's a great story if I have time to tell it.
Yeah,
we caught him in August, and the very next day he took off and left the study area. We had a 60,000 acre study area, a bunch of landowners cooperating and letting us collar adult bucks. And he leaves the study area. And he moved 13 miles away. And we thought, oh, goodness, what did we do? Did he get mad at us? Did we stress him out so bad he left?
Yeah.
Well, he didn't come back until the following, I believe it was February. He came back to the original study area. He had lived 13 miles away all during the hunting season and then came back to where we'd captured him. And he did that the next August. And we thought, oh, son of a gun, this must be his scheduled movement pattern. We were lucky to catch him right before he did his normal movement, because within about a week, the same week, he moved to the same area and had a fairly large home range over there. Again, came back in February. So he was like our poster child for extreme distances. Now, we did some more telemetry studies in what we call the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, what Mississippians call the Delta area. And it's like Vicksburg up to Memphis, big flood zone for the historical Mississippi River. And Corps of Engineers back in the 1900s built levees along it, and so it doesn't flood out as much, but there is flooding over the levees and backing up on river systems. And so there's this flooding effect, and it's also CWD management zone down there. And our wildlife agency wanted us to collar some deer, and it was part of a population estimation project. I won't get into all that detail, but we collared some bucks there and also adult does to look at their movement patterns. And you know what? We had, our sample size was relatively small, but the same proportion of bucks were mobile and sedentary. And we had a great example of a buck that sedentary, lived on about 1,000 acres, and he took some exploratory sallies. We had another buck that this was in August. We captured him in January. He left in March and swam the Mississippi River and spent from March to August in Louisiana. I think that was about 18 miles linear distance away. And the river there where he crossed is about a mile across. So this was not just wading across a creek.
Yeah.
He swam the Mississippi River.
Holy crap.
And then in August, again, he came back and went back to his same location in the area where he captured him. And then the following March, boom, goes back to Louisiana And this past August 22, he came back again around a week within the same week. So there's these patterns of, and he's now our poster child for the extreme mobile kind of buck. But then we've also got within the mobile bucks that live in 2 or more home ranges, there's some that aren't quite as distinct as that. They will move back and forth maybe a half a dozen different times during the year. So it's not like I'm living here and then I'm going to pick up and I'm going to live over there. They live 2 different places, but they go back and forth. It's like I'm going to visit my friends over here and I'll stay for a month and I'll come back and spend a month and then go back. And so we've looked at the timing of these movements. The 2 poster child deer I talked about, bucks, they basically March and February and then returned in August. But there's these other mobile bucks that aren't that distinct. They move back and forth a bunch of different times. So when a mobile buck is going to move has not been nailed down. Maybe we need another 30 or 40 mobile buck samples before we can really develop a peak of that pattern.
Are you guys noticing any different cover types, in those areas? Like maybe one limiting resource in one area that's being overcompensated in another?
Yeah, that was our first guess. Like, well, they must not like something here, and they're going to get something else. No.
Obvious
the buck
change.
that swam Mississippi River, he went from a forested area with soybean fields nearby to a forested area with soybean fields nearby.
Yeah, that's frustrating. So I remember years ago or whatever in grad school I remember hearing about like a caller doe that, kind of the same thing, traveled outside of the territory and just kind of like, where's this deer going? Like every year, the same around the same time, goes to the same spot, makes the same abnormal, excursion, and then comes back to her home range and go to find out it's a nutrient spring, that's coming in, has high, sodium contents and stuff like that. And they're going there to, replenish after a fawning, and, they take their fawns there every year. And then you see those fawns will take their offspring every year. And, it's just a limiting agent that they, find. So I always wonder about that with caller data, and I don't get to do the research. So pops up into your head. What influences have you seen with, heavy agriculture? Because I don't know what it's like down where you guys are, but here in the Midwest, in Ohio, where I am, we have, obviously this isn't the norm for everything, but I would say a normal, good property size is probably like 30 acres, somewhere in the 15 to 40 acres, we'll say. So a lot of that is either monocrop agriculture, production agriculture, or livestock, ag land, that type of stuff. I would assume from the biological standpoint that those types of environments would increase the home ranges of even a mobile buck, because the resources aren't as plentiful. I mean, there's food there, but there's not a whole lot of cover, because a lot of the timber stands here you can see 200 yards through it. It's closed canopy system, stunted understory growth. There's just not a lot of stuff there. And, everyone's like, well, I got beans here. Well, okay. That's part of it. Like you said, they need to avoid that, even though it is a buck, it is still a prey species. So what have you guys seen, whether it's in partnership with places like Michigan State or Penn State or whoever, what have you guys seen, if you can talk to it, on the habitat of the heavy agriculture? Is that causing any shifts?
Yeah, even within our sedentary bucks, you can look at like monthly groupings of locations, and you'll see them shifting within their sedentary home range. And oftentimes, they'll be near the soybeans until they're harvested, and then they'll shift away to other resources. So they're definitely responding to nutrient pulses, abundant quality nutrition. I mean, soybean plants are the ideal summer forage for deer. But the interesting thing, when you start wondering about what deer eat and why, you think, well, goodness, they're just going to eat a diet of all soybeans because that's the best. But deer need to balance their nutrient intake, and too much of a good thing is not a good thing.
A bad thing.
And so they eat a certain proportion of their diet in soybeans. They're going to have to go in to other areas within their home range and eat other stuff to kind of balance out that really rich, high quality diet with some other stuff that's kind of filler to let their GI tract function properly.
Yeah, that microbiome and getting all that
going. So complex.
Yeah, oh, for sure. Have you guys seen anything in terms of, obviously movement patterns like what you just described, different variations in available, high quality forages, native forages, that kind of thing. Has there been any studies, and I probably should look this up, but, it just popped into my head. Has there been any studies on, travel patterns in terms of, I guess I'll call it more primary habitat, conditions, early successional areas, well-developed forest areas with, browse opportunities on edge lines, things like that, versus supplemental like food plots, as far as what they're seeing. I mean, anything statistically relevant in terms of that.
Can we hold that thought?
Yeah,
I want to touch one more thing about that, the personality stuff.
Yeah, that's fine.
Up in northern distribution of whitetails, it's very common to see two home ranges in a deer population. There are a lot of deer that move to winter yarding areas underneath conifers that have a really dense canopy cover, and
good thermal
deer
cover.
Just kind of pile into them. So, I don't know if they do that in Ohio, but certainly above that, up in that M state, they have deer yards.
You're learning.
And or that state to the
north. Yeah.
We won't even mention the first letter.
I'm going to give you an Ohio t-shirt right there.
So migratory movements for whitetails is not a new deal. What we're excited about is it hasn't been documented previously in the South at all. And up there, it's not all deer do it, but a lot of the deer do. The percentage, couldn't quote the exact percentage off the top of my head, but a percentage do these major migratory movements, and state agencies manage to protect deer yard type habitat because it's so important to overwinter survival. It's never been reported in the South, but there's been instances where a couple of deer showed stuff in our data in the past that was like, that's interesting. But we never had enough sample size to really, tease it out, and enough, these extreme animals that like, whoa, I wonder how many other deer do this and look for patterns. And so I'm really looking forward to, in the next year or two, is working with other universities, University of Georgia, Auburn, LSU, southeastern states that have databases on deer movements that they haven't reported this, but maybe they haven't looked at it. So I want to do this big meta-analysis with colleagues from other southern states and look for the pattern and see how prevalent it is. A lot of the areas we've worked in are associated with rivers. And so the easy thing is to say, well, maybe it's just an adaptation to flooding. And we know when the Mississippi River floods, deer move out of the flooded areas. It makes sense. But when they move, the samples we've got, they don't necessarily move in response to a flood. They move when they move. We haven't, again, come up with an overall, this is when they move, because there's so much variation. So back to why are they doing it? You asked, well, is it habitat variation or whatever? I think it's almost like a philosophical question. There has to be a benefit to the deer population overall for deer to be risk takers. Because when a deer moves a long distance, they have a greater risk. They're crossing highways. They're going to get hit by cars. They're showing up in habitats that they don't necessarily know who's where in terms of predators, hunters. The many hunters in your listening audience, our listening audiences for Deer University, they shoot these bucks and like, I haven't seen this buck before. You mentioned it earlier on a buck you hadn't seen before. So these bucks just show up. Well, it's either they're on an excursion, or maybe they've lived in your area before and you just hadn't picked them up before.
Hadn't picked it up.
So these movements are extreme and they're risky. So why do deer do it? Well, there has to be a benefit genetically to the population, the survival of the deer population over time. And so I think there's some benefit. There's almost like a genetic programming for some to just be movers. They have this risk taker personality that shows itself in movement patterns that take risk. But knowing what's out there is helpful. The study I mentioned in South Texas, we had a relatively small sample. We had one buck that we followed for 4 years. And the first year was the end of a fairly significant drought in this area. And in South Texas, there's really dry periods and there's really moist periods, and there's occasional year that's kind of average. And it was the end of a really severe drought. And during that first year, he'd kind of been over in this other area, and then almost like 2 home ranges, but just a little bit. But we picked it up. And then it started raining that year, and he never went back for 3 years. In the 4th year, it was getting dry again, and you know where he went?
Went back there.
Back to that spot. There was something over there that he needed when it got dry. We never did document exactly what it was, but there's benefits to these risk takers. They get killed more often because they're risky movements, but there has to be some benefit. So philosophically, I just get goosebumps thinking about stuff like that. What matters is that they do it.
Yeah, it just so many things go around in your head, because I look at it from a habitat management standpoint. Doing a lot of early successional work and managing for native forages and plants out there, whether it's you want your cover to equal food, right? I mean, that's a good equation to have. I have a native early successional of goldenrods and asters and ragweeds that's able to develop, and if you want to intersperse your supplemental food plotting into those areas. I mean, you've got bedding cover, you got fawning cover, you got food sources. And when you got a good cluster of does and things like that, come the season, you're going to have, bucks that are going to be in there. And I just always wonder where, on properties where, okay, I've got, this type of management practice here, but the food plot's over here, kind of where the cluster is. And I've always been interested to see, caller deer to say, hey, I've got this area of pristine, really good early successional habitat adjacent to a good managed, timber stand with, select cut practices, crop release practices, good edge line. It's like, can I get, obviously that home range of that deer is going to be still pretty large in comparison to most people's property. Mm-hmm. But is that, statistically, can we model what we, infer that, that's going to hold deer onto your property a lot more to get people to invest in burning and managing that ugly mess that they don't want to look at. That's not the greatest photo to send and brag to your friends, but nutritionally and biologically, ecologically, whatever you want to call it, has the greater bang for its buck as far as holding deer onto your property. Mm-hmm. And in cases like mine, those bucks that are on excursions or that are moving will, be more drawn in to come to those areas. I don't know if there's been anything like that or not.
Well, we've looked at that question, Eric, both back in South Texas study days and also in our Central Mississippi studies. And consistently, bedding areas, or these concentrated areas that deer use, have high species diversity at 6 feet and below.
Yeah.
And if you have a lot of species, you've got structural cover. And if you've got a lot of species, probably some of those species can be eaten. And so you touched on, what you were talking about, the habitats you were talking about there. That's perfect, because you've got diverse structure to hide in, which, what the 3 things I talked about that are basis for deer movements is they got to eat, they got to survive, and then they got to breed. So eating and surviving, you're talking about food and cover. And if you can create spaces on your property, small properties, it doesn't matter. You create small clumps of many species of vegetation, herbs, and woody brush and shrubs within the 6 feet and below, and you've created deer habitat that's cover and food. Now, the problem with small managed property is that other third thing, they got to breed. And so once the breeding season happens, they're not thinking so much about eating. They're thinking about breeding.
Yeah, for sure. And that's where I kind of tell people, I'm like, a lot of times people want to manage for bucks. And I'm like, you really, there's obviously, logic to that. I said, but, and really you should be managing for does, because you're going to, have a higher, just going to have more of an impact. I mean, if you've got does, you're going to have bucks, just period. If you have a barren wasteland on a property and you barely see a doe, you're probably not going to see a buck unless it just happens to be walking by and you're lucky enough to sit in that stand. So, it's a double-edged sword for sure.
You said something there. I have to talk about it.
No problem.
Doe management is critical.
Yeah.
We could have a whole podcast on that. But
for sure.
I'm just going to jump in real quick. If you build the right habitat, the bucks will come and the does will come. Now, some property managers say, well, we're not going to shoot any of our does until after the breeding season because we want all the does, and so bring in all the bucks. And I tell people, but those kind of situations, you don't normally end up harvesting the does that you need to harvest for population control. And
it's
so
a trickle-down problem.
You don't want to just protect all your does and think that you're going to bring in all these bucks. So it's really, you got to think holistically about deer management. Yes, you build the habitat, they will come, but you need to maintain the quality of that habitat, and that involves population regulation.
Yeah, for sure. I had Dr. Galsby, on the podcast. He's awesome. And we talked about predator management, and we were talking the same thing. I mean, it all comes back to good habitat. I mean, because, deer, these animals have been around far beyond, we were, and they've been perfectly interacting with the landscape prior to us, managing our properties. And in terms of predator management, it's like, even he was saying that should really be like the last step of your checklist, because if you've got good habitat and you're really building good quality, diverse habitat for a wide range of species, their natural ecology, they can avoid predators. Now,
absolutely,
you're going to have some that are going to succumb to predation, disease, things like that. But you don't want you don't want them to succumb to nutrition. You don't want them to become nutritionally depleted and then not be able to avoid predation from 2 or 3 or even a single, large coyote. I mean, it all comes back to good habitat. And if you want to help predict deer movement, you have to have good habitat.
Yep.
And too many people just want that pill like they can throw in their mouth.
Yeah, simple.
Dr. Demarais, give me the answer.
Yeah.
Where is that booner going to be come the right?
Yeah.
It just doesn't work like that.
Trapping some coyotes isn't going to solve your problem.
Oh my God. People will die on that sword, man. And me and Dr. Galsby were talking about it. That's why I wanted to have him on. I'm like, out of all the things, I think the predator control and the moon phase are probably two of the biggest thing that people will die on their sword.
Yep.
I see these Facebook groups all the time. I was saying on that podcast where people are posting about predator control. It's just like, kill them all, hang them from your fence line. I'm like, oh my God. Anyway.
Well, and I got to talk about this now. There's so many things.
Hey, I get it all the time. We can talk about whatever. Sometimes I talk out of my ass and just stirs up other stuff. So,
So back in the 2000s, a lot of people were started doing fawn mortality studies, and they would do a study where there was a fawn survival problem, and they'd show, well, gee, there's coyotes and bobcats are eating a lot of fawns, and so the simple solution, well, we need to control our predators. So to me, the biggest problem in the Southeast is the quality of the habitat and the number of deer relative to the quality of the habitat. And so in a lot of places, I'm glad those predators are eating a lot of animals because the habitat doesn't support the population because it's not good quality habitat. So we wanted to do a study. We had, I think, 17 different properties. We studied over a 2-year period. We set up camera traps for predators with appropriate bait, and we set up camera traps for deer. And we looked at fawn recruitment and relative predator numbers on 17 properties over 2 years, very large study in terms of, most fawn mortality studies are done on a property. And the reason they do it there is because there's a problem with fawn recruitment. So they do a study and it shows predators a problem. Well, we wanted to look across a range of properties in Alabama and Mississippi and over 2 years. So we did this study, and the rough, and I can't remember the exact correlation coefficient, but there was literally no relationship between fawn recruitment and relative predator numbers. And we looked at the number of coyotes, the number of bobcats, the number of all predators. There was no relationship. Now, if you want to cherry pick, you could find about a third of those properties where the more predators they had, the fewer fawns were recruited. But we could also cherry pick about a third of the properties where more predators were actually associated with more fawn recruitment, which doesn't make sense.
It does make sense, yeah.
And then another third of them, there was no relationship. And so when you look at a broad scale, you cannot generalize that predators have anything to do with fawn recruitment. In some places, yes, they do, but probably because they don't have adequate habitat, like Dr. Goolsby was saying and you were saying.
Yeah, it
comes
just
down to
boils
habitat
down to
quality.
Everything. I mean, if you give them everything they need, their natural ecology will be able to handle it. Oh, we could go down.
Yeah.
You're gonna
So
elicit
we're trying to talk
visceral,
about deer movement.
a visceral
here,
response. I get heated because it's just here in Ohio. You always hear people, I don't see deer. Blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, look at your property. Like, I mean, yeah, you got awesome property. Like, it's a nice piece of property. You got 40 acres, but it's 34% or 34 acres in row crop. You got manicured lawn. You got shitty timber. Like, you see deer there, but probably not until nighttime because it's wide open.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of segueing into what I wanted to kind of next year on the list is, what have you guys talking about movement patterns during the day? What's the percentage? And I think I've heard you guys talk about that on other episodes, as far as percentage of, let me look at my notes here, the buck behavior traits as far as bedding, the feeding and the walking, and then how that correlates to, either daytime or nighttime.
Yeah, we have, let me pull out a figure here. Just looking at the time of day, we broke it up into 24 hours into 4 periods. Dawn, and we use this term crepuscular to describe deer activity patterns, kind of circa around sunset and around sunrise. And deer are moving all during the night. They are night creatures, but we tend to see them late afternoon and early morning, and that's when we try to focus on our hunting opportunities. Deer are moving all during the night, but they have multiple movement periods. They go out. Again, what are the 3 things? They got to eat and survive. So they eat as quickly as they can to get their optimum diet, and then they bed down and chew their cud. And so during the night, they'll have several feeding bouts with small bedding times in between for an hour or 2 where they chew their cud. So you have multiple movement opportunities during the night. And then during the day, especially during the hunting season, not during the peak of breeding, there's not much activity on the buck side during the day. So if I look at our data from time spent in behaviors by rut phase, pre-rut, before the rut even, before there's any does coming into breeding activity, let's see, 50% of the buck's time is spent bedded. This is over, the entire day. 50% is spent bedded. That's a lot of time to just be bedded. Yeah. And where are they bedding? In a structured habitat that hides them, because they're a prey species. Got to think, what are they? Yeah. They're prey. They got to find cover. 50% of the time is cover. And then
not in your timber spot that you can see 200 yards through. And I can pick a deer. It's right there.
I used to, before I knew what I was doing, I used to love those big wide open timber stand. Oh man, I can see any deer moving in here. This is great.
These ferns look great.
Goodness.
Yeah. Anyway,
but so 50% bedded, and then the amount of time they spend walking is about 15%. So walking is, where they're moving significantly. Yeah. And then 35% is probably what we'd call feeding activity. And that's pre-rut, before any does are in coming into estrus. Peak of the rut, and in pretty much any deer population in the United States, the breeding season is about a 45-day interval. That's when all the adult does are bred within a 45-day interval. But it's a very distinct peak in that there's about 2 weeks when most of the breeding takes place, and the other 2 weeks on either side of those there's some breeding activity taking place, but most of it takes place during a 2-week interval. And so I like to look at early rut, peak rut, and late rut. So if I can just jump over to peak rut. So the bedded time was 50% before any breeding happened. And then during the peak of the rut, the bedded drops down to 40%. And the walking increases from 15 up to 25% of their time. So, the relative activities of bucks when there's no breeding, a lot of bedded time, not much walking. When there's does on the landscape, multiple does in estrus, they're out there looking and walking, and they're still going to bed down, but they spend much more time walking, and that's why that's why we hunt the peak of the rut. Everybody wants to know what's the peak of the rut in my area, because I want to know when I want to focus on hunting.
Well, and that's an interesting point too, not to diverge a little bit, but that just comes back to, really educating yourself and understanding, because, there are things that you can do that, if, I'm sure, like every hunter out there, I've got a bunch of friends that hunt, someone harvests the doe in your area, let's say January, February, understand, go to what once was the QDMA and the NDA now, and understand how to do fetal measurements. Like check, see, is that doe pregnant? Right. And if you really want to narrow down when that doe was bred, okay. And again, it's sample size, but now you get 5 or 6 buddies that have harvested a doe that you can, hey, guess what? That week between November 7th and the 14th, all this measurement goes back to there, and it goes back to what you're saying and being able to judge movement. Mm-hmm. If you really want to pattern a deer, and taking that little biological data, that can go a long way as far as a management program goes.
Yeah, and you have to be able to harvest the doe 30 or 40 days after the peak of breeding to be able to look back.
Yeah, I threw those numbers.
I just happened to be out yesterday with a friend, and we sampled a couple of adult does, and both of them had fetuses in them, and those fetuses were about 40 days old, both of the does. So, and they're both 5-year-old does, and they both bred about 40 days before they were harvested. And that informed us about the breeding dates on that particular property. We already knew when peak breeding was there, but it's added to our database. So, back to the movement stuff and the timing. Another analysis we did with our central Mississippi study, we looked at the daily home range, because we wanted to see what the daily home range was for a buck.
Oh, okay.
And because that's the time frame that a hunter deals with. I'm going out and hunting today. What's the average home range of a buck while I'm hunting? And this our day was actually 24 hours, but it's within that context of a day I'm going to hunt. The average home range for all of our bucks, not worrying about personality, was 200 acres a day. So over one day, 24 hours, 200 acres. Now, the interesting thing, we broke it out pre-rut, peak rut, late rut, post rut. Is consistent, 200 acres. It wasn't, the timing of the breeding season didn't affect the daily home range, 200 acres consistent. But if you look at the 2-week home range for the bucks during those same 2-week intervals, so pre-rut, the daily home range was about 600 acres. So that's when no breeding takes place. So the 2-week home range was about 600 acres. So over that 2-week period, a buck is going to cover about 600 acres. During the peak of the rut, that increased about 50% to almost 900 acres. Now, what's really interesting, and it makes sense when you think about it, the late rut, this is that, I talked about the 2 weeks when most of the breeding, 2 weeks before when some of the does were getting bred, and the 2 weeks after when there's another 15% or so of the does that are coming into estrus. Late rut, the 2-week home range was 1,600 acres.
What?
Yeah, because the peak of the rut, that 2-week period, there's enough does in a relatively small area, so the bucks are finding estrus does within a relatively small area. So that's why it went up from 200 up to wait a minute, did I say? Yeah, went up from 600 up to 900. So it's a 50% bump. There's still a lot of does, estrus does around because it's the peak of the rut. 60 to 70% of the does in an area are breeding during that 2-week period. So in the late rut, you only got about 15% of the does that are going to be bred. And so they're more spread out across the landscape.
Yeah.
So it makes perfect sense that during the post rut, the late rut, that second 2 week after the peak of rut, they're covering more area because they're having to work harder to find those estrus does.
Yeah. And that's why I confuse it too with post rut, because that's why I was like 6. I'm like, man, like post rut, they got to be exhausted.
Yeah, post rut, it dropped back down to about 800 acres in post rut.
So still even more.
They're still doing, because you get this what we call the second rut when
that's what I was gonna.
Does not every doe that's bred takes, and not every pregnancy takes. And 10 to 15% of the does are not going to take their first breeding. So they're going to recycle about 28 days later.
Do you typically see with that second rut, or do you typically see the same statistics as far as I guess basically what am I asking? That second rut comes in. Are you seeing that they have enough basically energy, if you will, within a short time to put that much effort? Because like you've been talking about the 3 things, one of the things, how many copies of myself can I make? Type of thing. So is there that much expenditure into the second rut? Because you kind of hear like the second rut's not that big of a deal, but from the movement standpoint, are they putting in the currency, if you will, to make the same, effort as they did in the first initial primary rut?
Well, we can look at the time spent in behaviors during each day, and remember in the peak rut, I said the percent of their time spent bedded was 40%, and their percent time moving was 25%. Yeah. Well, in the post rut, when their bedded percentage bumps back up to 50%, and their time spent walking drops down below 10%.
Yeah, they're exhausted.
They're worn out. And you know what increased during that time period was the amount of time they spend feeding.
They have to replenish their nutrients. Yeah.
So it's like, well.
So that is a very good point for people to really like listen to what he said there, because here in Ohio, we talk, the biological change that occurs when deer, separate out of that bachelor group, that lipogenic shift that they're going to have, their biophysiology changes to where what you just said right there, like, again, it comes back to habitat. Like, you have to really plan and manage your habitat correctly so that those individual bucks can replenish their food. That's why you target, cool season, cereal grains that are high carbohydrate, values that are immediate, blood sugar, things like that. It's just to be able to provide those food sources. And in a lot of areas where, browse is the main food source that time of year, having timber stand improvements and stuff like that is actually, I would imagine, vital to making your property one of those areas where post-rut, they're like, hey, there is a lot of nutrition over here that I can go and replenish and fuel up for that second rut coming in. It all comes back to habitat and proper planning.
Yep. And one of the most common topics hunters and landowners want to talk about in the South is food plots. And we spend a lot of time trying to educate people. We say, summertime is the critical nutritional time period. And so plant food plots in the summertime that is going to have abundant, high quality forage. But then when they think about their fall plantings, they're thinking about a green field, a harvest green field. And we say, no, don't think about a green field for harvesting. Yeah, that's going to take place, but think about what it's going to be like in 4 months after you plant it. What is it going to be providing in the post-rut for post-rut recovery? So the two nutritional potentially stressful periods in the South, summertime and post-rut recovery.
It's the same here.
Does it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the same here. I mean, just even biologically, it makes sense. I mean, you spend all that time. I mean, I didn't know the numbers. I mean, if you're going from, 600 to 900 acres to 1,600 acres, that's a lot of movement. I mean, I could imagine what those point vertices, the linear footage probably adds up to. That's got to be a staggering amount. The length of this point to that point to that point, to where, that makes sense. Like, theoretically, as a biologist, that makes sense. And to most hunters, post-rut, knowing what the average hunter today, I mean, is so much more educated, on topics like this. I mean, it just makes complete sense. But to actually have numbers behind it to say, hey, post-rut, after they've done breeding, their feeding percentage exponentially went up to, what would you say, 20? 30? What was it?
The amount of time it went from 35 up to 40% of the time spent feeding. And their time spent walking in peak rut was 25%, and it's down to below 10%.
Yeah, now if you go back to your cover equaling food, and they don't have to walk as far and go through so much, biological currency, and they can replenish. I mean, again, it just all comes back to that. That's interesting to hear that, though. It's just so many things going through my head.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, I mean, talking about all the things going through our heads. I mean, we could chase a lot of rabbits here. But I think to come back to the central theme is think about those three things that deer need to do. They need to eat and they need to breed. And if you build the right kind of habitat, you'll have does being maintained on your property because they have cover and good food. And if you have the does and that good quality habitat, the bucks will be there. But make sure you're harvesting your does before the breeding season. Don't wait until, think I'm going to do it later, because you won't, probably.
Probably not.
So
we always say we're going to do it later. I know I do. My wife, it drives her nuts.
Yeah. But you get tired of it. It was like, in Mississippi, we have a 4-month hunting season. I don't know about Ohio. And Ohio, I've heard referred to as God's country of the North. Is that true?
I guess, yeah. Yeah, ours typically starts October and then first week of February. So we've got a pretty long season as well.
Yeah, so you could get kind of tired of hunting almost.
Yeah, well, it's for sure. I know some people will lie to you and say that they don't, but when it gets to be 10 degrees outside and you're 20 feet up into a deer stand, you get tired of that shit pretty quick.
Yeah, and if you've already harvested a deer or two and you got meat in the freezer,
same here.
And
I've got 2.
Yeah, this has been great this afternoon. I don't know that I want to
Yeah,
go
I let my
drag
dogs
out
out
a
in the
deer.
morning. I'm like, nope, ain't happening. Yeah, I've got my buck and I got a doe already this year, and I was like, yeah, do I really want to go out? Yeah, I mean, right now it's 46 degrees out right now, and it's going to drop back down to winter temperatures. Ohio is notorious for fluctuating up and down, up and down, up and down. That's why you're sick all the time. Up here, you're raining, then it's snowing, then the rain freezes, and it's icy, and it's a nightmare. So we can kind of. One last thing to kind of talk about before we wrap this up is how hunting pressure really influences, deer patterns, deer movement in general. I mean, of course, I think everyone knows, but from the research standpoint, what have you guys seen?
Well,
from that?
back to the question of their prey animals, and so their job is to not be killed. Okay, and that's overridden by breeding during the peak of the rut, and that's why we see bucks that we hadn't seen before in the middle of the day chasing does, but they're prey, and so they're going to work really hard not to be killed. And we like to pattern deer, and I've been talking about these patterns from our data about what bucks do and don't do, and but they're patterning us as well, and they're probably a lot better at it than we are, because their entire lives is involved in eating and patterning predators and avoiding those predators. We go out on a weekend and hunt, and we're not living, some really hunters, deer nuts, hunt that's all they think about, but most of us don't do it that way. So we did an analysis on this 60,000 acre study area in central Mississippi. We had 55 bucks collared. We knew where the bucks were. And we also had all the hunters on this area identifying when and where they were hunting. So we were able to do a selection analysis, habitat selection by the deer and by the hunters. And guess what? They didn't match up. The areas where the hunters were hunting, the deer were avoiding.
Oh, yeah.
And the places that the hunters weren't hunting, the deer were using. And generally during the daytime. Now, food plots, we showed deer use food plots, but during the hunting season, they used them predominantly at night, not during the daytime.
Wide open, no cover.
Yeah. Why would a prey want to go walk out into the wide open and get shot at?
Same thing hunting corner of ag fields. It's like, why do I want to see deer? It's like, because they can come out, 30 different spots, and they're not going to walk out in the open. Mm-hmm. They're not stupid. I always say, if deer were any smarter, you'd never kill them. It's not my thought. I mean, you just kind of go with it. Yeah, it's always interesting because you hear so much, rightfully so. Proper access, stand rotation, things like that. And it's always, I tell people, do as I say, not as I do, because my parents' property, I don't have that many stands. It's not that big of a property, but it's the one primary stand location that I have that I probably default to all the time. The doe that I shot this year early in the season was a 2.5-year-old doe, but I have a matriarch doe on my parents' property. I almost pulled the trigger on her this year, but I would not be shocked if she's a 5+ year old deer. Mm-hmm. And she's always been a good producer. She's always had, twins. I've always had good fawn recruitment on the property. And it's always funny because there'll be hunts out there where I'll see her and some yearlings and something I'm not interested in shooting. And, I'll see her, like the yearlings will walk in, because my stand is a transient area. There's food over here. They're bedding over here. And, I see them every night. Now, whether or not they go that way or this way, by my stand is just luck of the draw, but I see them every night. And it's always funny because I'll see her come in and she's like, okay, I'm going to back off a little bit because this is the area where I see my, sister or something like that from, years ago, or there's something bad happens, every time. And I had to change things up because, I was really getting patterned by them, as I said, okay, there's a stand area that I put that I was like, it's not the greatest, but it worked. This year because they kept circling around. They'd start circling around. They're like, I'm not walking through here anymore. And, just goes what you said. I mean, they are smarter than we think that they are, and they pattern us just as much. I remember Kip, Adams from the NDA. I think it was Kip and talking about, maybe it was one of the deer steward courses that I did. talking about, you got to understand that deer live in the woods 365 days out of the year, 24/7. That little noise that you maybe didn't even register is completely different, to what they normally hear, and puts them on guard. Because you hear people all the time, I don't understand how they saw me. They didn't smell me. Probably did, but you did something that's just not normal to what they normally interact with. And that causes shifts in movement. Hey, something I don't like over here, we're going to go this way, type of thing. So it's just, it just comes down to everything. I mean, I'm not reinventing the wheel here. This has been talked about, to death.
Hey, I might refer your listeners to a Quality Whitetails article in the winter issue. And I think NDA has also had it on their online website, talking about deer vision. And it's
pretty recent.
Really great. Yeah. And it talks about the amazing ability of in deer vision. That's just one of 3 things that they use to outsmart you.
Yeah.
And it's really cool. And they talk about the fact that, deer are not really good at refining details because their eyes are on either side of their head.
Yeah.
And so their ability to really look close like we can at something is very limited. So they're not good at defining or seeing things. That's one time I was hunting, and I had climbed up literally this small mountain back in New England, and by the time I got up to the top, I was sweating, and I thought, man, I'm gonna get rid of my T-shirt, and just because it was sopping wet, and I didn't want to start freezing 30 minutes later. So I'm pulling off my jacket and all my layers, and I'm down to my T-shirt, and the steam is coming off. And I look down, just, like glance over that way, and there's a doe family unit walking along the trail that I happened to be standing in why did I stand in the trail when I was taking my clothes off? I don't know. Yeah. I'm literally sitting on a stump, taking my clothes off, and I'm down to my T-shirt, steaming, and the does had just come out of some cover, and the lead doe is looking at me, and I'm looking at her, and she starts stomping her feet.
What are you?
Yeah, she knew I didn't look quite right, but she had no specific details of me. Yeah. And she stomped and snorted, and she finally, maybe a minute or 2 later, jumped off and ran in a different direction. So they can't distinguish detail, but they're great at distinguishing movement.
Yeah.
And so just that little movement you make.
Yeah. Yeah. Prey species. It's more of an investment to be able to detect movement and not quite know what it is and make you uneasy than like a predator's vision to be able to hone in on something, tunnel vision. I know for sure that's just always fascinating. Like I remember I read that article when Kip shared it on social media, and that's just always fascinating to me. Like I don't understand it. Well, like I'll send it. I'm like, you guys see that? They're like, I don't really care. I'm like, how do you not care? Like, how do you hunt and that doesn't intrigue you at all?
Yeah.
Like on how good they are. It's like, and it just goes to show what I was asking in the beginning. Because I remember, again, listening to Dr. Miller in the past talk about how as technology evolves, like how we're able to refine things. That's a perfect example is how deer vision actually works, that we're able to detect that. And I go back in the 70s, when you're talking about the understanding of deer's vision compared to what it is today. Like imagine what's going to be in another 10 or 15 years, type of thing. It's just intriguing. It's just amazing that out of all the information that we have, they are still so hard to kill. Yep. You got to respect it, and for people, just when you see stuff like that, I'm like, God, you just take all this information. I mean, it's an overload though. I understand why people are just like, my head hurts. I was getting new, like we were talking off air, I'm getting a new camera system here for the podcast studio. And I'm just like, my cousin's an expert in this stuff. He's got advanced degrees in multimedia productions and stuff like that. And I'm just like, dude, just tell me what camera I got to get. Like it hurts my head. Like I don't even know what's going on. And I can imagine someone listening to, talk about deer nutrition. They're like, wait a minute, this guy over here told me to do this. And now it's like, oh my Lord. Oh, it can be stressful. For sure.
Yep.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. I know I've kept you here for over an hour. Why don't you go ahead once again, and I'm going to have all this information, the show notes and stuff like that in the description, but go ahead and plug your guys' podcast and your social media and how people can get a hold of you and if they got questions.
Okay. Our podcast is Deer University. So just search for Deer University, DEER University. Our emphasis is translating scientific knowledge into why it matters to hunters. And Bronson and I are deer nuts, and we love it. And we've been blessed to be able to spend our lives researching deer, and we want to help people learn from it. And so we have the website, msudeerlab.com. We have a YouTube channel that is, if you just search MSU Deer Lab on YouTube or Twitter, Facebook, we have postings on those for MSU Deer Lab. So that's our brand, is the MSU Deer Lab, and we'd love to help inform your audience for things that they don't know.
Yeah, and I've been a fan, like I said, for a while. So those of you listening, it's definitely good research to have, and things to listen to, podcasts to listen to when you drive and you want to change things up for sure. So, all right, Dr. Demarais, thank you for coming on. I appreciate your time and talking with us, and hopefully we'll have you on again.
Great, it's been a real joy, Eric, and it's great to have a fellow biologist that gets it, and wants to share the information.
Yeah, you know what? I'm like you. I always tell people, I am a certified wildlife biologist, and that's what people but I'm like, listen, pump the brakes. I don't do full-time wildlife all the time. I mean, I do a lot of it, but I'm more of a natural resource biologist. I mean, like you said, jack of all trades, master of none.
Yep.
I know the team to put together if I got to do a big project.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, for me, it's the same thing. The same kind of mission as what you guys have is I am an educator as well. I teach at university, not as full-time like you guys do, but I have a passion for teaching. I love educating people and helping people. And, me personally, I enjoy the management, side almost more than I do the actual hunting side, type of thing. But, that's why I started this podcast, to get guys like you, industry experts, and people that have their ears to the ground and are really at the forefront of this stuff to come on and help educate me as well as my guests. So I appreciate everything you do and taking time to come on, like I said. So thank you.
Take care.
All right, everybody. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for checking in, and we will be seeing you soon.
And that's a wrap on another episode of the HuntScience podcast. I want to thoroughly take this time to thank everybody who has listened or even watched till the end of this episode and had the opportunity to hopefully enjoy the show that we put out for you. It's something that we're really trying to do and take notes and put good quality content for everybody to enjoy. We want to take this moment also to, if you enjoyed the show, check us out over on our social media platforms. Give us a like, give us a follow, check that bell notification, look for the content that we're putting out. Of course, reach out to us, leave comments. Did you like the show? We would love to hear your reviews of the show and any concerns that you have, any updates or any type of feedback to make our content better. We're always open ears for the people that are consuming our show and our content. We want to hear from you. What is it that you want to see, and what is it that you would like us to do? If you want to check us out on any of our social media, first off, you can head over to our website, go to www.huntsciencepodcast.com. You can check us out on Instagram at HuntScience_podcast, or you can check us out over at our Facebook page at The HuntScience Podcast. Any of those is open. You can, like I said, feel free to comment and all of the above that you do with social media. I just want to take this time again to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for everybody for watching and listening to the content that we're putting out. It means the world to me, and I can't wait for you guys to join us on another episode. Until then, everybody, have a great day, and we'll see you next time.